Shorser from the University of Toronto. Lindsey will talk about multiple simultaneous course experiences in a first-year calculus course. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here and giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Pam. That was amazing. Like, so much to think about. But hopefully this will also give you something to consider. It's my experience of trying to redesign a calculus course. Too much to fit into one talk, but this is the part that had the technology in it. So this is the plan. I would like to walk you through universal design and Kolb's learning cycle very quickly, just to set up what was a false dichotomy, but seemed like a very real dichotomy to me when I was trying to design this course, and how I solved or resolved that conflict by using technology, and then show what happened to the student experience given those solutions. So some context, I am coordinating a first-year calculus course, but the second half. So please keep in mind, every student in this course has already passed the first half, which I think is key to understanding which solutions I chose. And questionable as to whether or not this would be good for the first half of calculus. Unclear to me at this moment. Okay, so the first thing I kept in mind was the principles of universal design. I came across this when I was teaching a software design course in computer science, but these principles are pretty much for anything in design. So let's say you're an architect and you're going to design a public building. You could try to think of every single use case, like, okay, so someone might be trying to enter the building and they're in a wheelchair. Okay, so we should put a ramp, maybe an elevator. Okay, so now, and then you can build on, like, is the elevator useful to everybody? But trying to think of every single use case is quite difficult. And the idea behind the principles of universal design is that instead of trying to find all these edge cases, or just like the general case that you're not aware of, because the general case doesn't include the designer, you could aim for these principles. So as long as you aim for the principles, you're getting a wide variety of users using whatever it is you're designing. And so in the case of a course, you can ask yourself, okay, so what can I do to reduce barriers that students might have in general? Not specific student barriers, but what are some general things that might prevent a student for any reason and increase their access to the course and to learning and to the experiences I want them to have. So here are the 7 principles. You're welcome to look them up for greater detail. I guess I'll just point out a couple, like principle 4, perceptible information. If you want someone to know what a button does in a software program, you could put the word, like, let's say it's the save button, you could put the word save, or you could put an icon that's generally recognized to mean save, but of course generally recognized in different generations means something different. So that's a whole nother conversation. But these aren't rules, they're principles. The idea is to aim for what you think would be more equitable use, more flexibility in how people engage with whatever you're designing. In particular, there's a lot of ways of interpreting this for education. And so we have a link at the bottom here to CAST.org. So CAST is a nonprofit organization that does research and development for education, I believe. And so they have recently released Universal Design for Education 3.0. So you're welcome to see their more up-to-date version of how they're interpreting this to mean more accessibility and fewer barriers to entry into courses. And so I've put them here as 2 different lists of 3, but they're actually presented as a grid on the website. So on the one hand, we're designing for engagement. So getting students to basically, it's all the stuff Pam talked about, and knowing why they're doing it and keeping them motivated. Also the representation of the what. So just like, what are you trying to teach them? The action and expression of the how. So they're going to be expressing themselves. They're going to, potentially writing assessments, giving presentations, some way of expressing what they've learned, and also engaging with each other, hopefully, as Dan was talking about, like the social engagement aspect of these courses. So for each of those, you can ask, okay, so who has access? Who is going to be motivated? Who's going to be understanding what exactly we're trying to teach and things like that. You can talk about the supports for each of these. And you can talk about the executive function aspect, which Olga did a fantastic job of, so I'm not even going to go there. But basically, this knits a lot of that together. And so the key that I took from this when I was thinking about this course was flexibility. Like, how can I make the course as flexible as possible? It had over 2,000 students. There's not a lot of room for one person to be flexible. So the flexibility couldn't be just from me. It had to be built in structurally into the course. With that in mind, I was also trying to use Kolb's active learning cycle. So this is, in case you haven't seen it before, this is the stages of the learning process as described by Kolb in an active and experiential way. So some people call it Kolb's experiential active learning cycle. And it looks like this. And theoretically, you could hop in the circle wherever. I decided to start describing it at having a motivational experience, because for me, that resonated as a math teacher. You want to motivate something and then reflect on it with the students. So, okay, what did we just see? And what is some abstract scaffolding that we can put around it, and then go back to the example and figure out why it works the way it does. And you can do that in a small case where it's within like a mini lesson within a larger lecture. You could do this in the entire course. So there's the first encounter with it, and then they go off and try it in tutorial, but it's guided, and then they go and learn it on their own as they're trying the homework, and then they reflect on that whole experience when they're studying for a test or something like that. So there's lots of ways of incorporating this into a course. That was one example. And so in my mind, there was this dichotomy of like, okay, so we want flexibility, universal design, everybody has access, everybody, no matter what their situation. Wouldn't it be great if everybody could have equal opportunity to benefit from this course? And then the flexibility aspect, and then the structure aspect. So how do I enforce some sort of like, you do the work, but then you also have to reflect on it. You also have to try it. You can't just sit back, watch a video and press fast forward when you're bored. Like, there has to be more to the course than that. And it contains online sections, in-person sections, online tutorials, in-person tutorials. So it's kind of a mess in that sense already. But the arguments for all of these aspects was accessibility in the first place. So taking that as a given, how can I balance this imposed structure, which I think will benefit all the students, with also, you know, trying to make it accessible, because not everybody's going to be able to do that. So the top part here, I have the obstacles to flexibility as I was perceiving them. So there's the time cost of like, okay, if I'm going to create different levels of practice problems for the test, so the students who are barely figuring this stuff out don't have to do really hard questions, get scared and demotivated and not study for the test, but the ones who actually are capable can actually engage with the material at that level. It'd be really hard to create these things. Not impossible, but that's a lot of work. So that was one thing I was thinking about. TAs cannot constantly grade the same assignment over and over and over. So deadlines are useful, and having people stick to them is quite useful, but not everyone can. And then what does that do for their experience of the course? So I was playing with this idea of, is there a way to give more flexible deadlines without overburdening the TAs and making it impossible? Because they're also students, and they also have their own work, and at some point they have to stop grading a given assignment. Also, what do you do for drop-in hours or office hours? So if I start making deadlines flexible, then what's to stop 5 different people coming to the same drop-in hour and ask different questions from 5 different weeks worth of material? And so there has to be some sort of way of figuring out how to prioritize what the course is doing and know what the course is doing. So even if some people are taking the flexible option, there has to be some sort of pressure to kind of stay on par with the course so that these drop-in hours are more useful for everybody involved. And then, of course, there's also the complexity of just administering a course that has deadlines all over the place, assignments all over the place. How can we sort of build in something that actually is manageable? So these are some of the things I was thinking about. There's also the active learning cycle, the way I wanted to implement it, which was to impose a structure where they'd actually go to lecture, hopefully, and there'd be some sort of engagement. So if we go back to the learning cycle, I was sort of hoping to get a little bit of the the abstracting and then experiment a bit and then abstract a bit and experiment a bit and have a lot of the other two quarters of this to be more tutorial and homework and things like that. So that was sort of where I was thinking of placing these things. So in lecture, having polling and activities and think, pair, share, and whatever structures the particular instructors wanted to have, because I'm designing a course within which instructors can make choices, and I really wanted that to be the case, where I could encourage things and maybe give some slides with some questions they could use, or I'm hoping to put some of those slides on Mathematize so they can use that next semester. We used Mathematize for other things, but hopefully that as well. So that it's a little easier for them to do it, but basically provide them with opportunities for active learning and then sort of read the room and decide if they want think, pair, share, or everybody votes, or something like that. And I wanted the tutorial activities to be very much students try working on things and the TA is there to support them. And wanted, which of course requires people to go to tutorial, unless there's a way around that. Because certainly I do want everyone to go to tutorial, but there will be students who can't for one reason or another. And so how can I still make the course accessible, even if it's slightly not as good to someone who can't make it to a tutorial? And then for the homework, I was using adaptive practices. So these are the kinds of online sets, like problem sets, where students can try a question, and if they're not quite sure what they're doing and they get it wrong, they're given a solution, and like this is how you actually do it, and a chance to look at the textbook to see, okay, this is how these kind of questions are actually done. Here's some examples, and then they go back, and later on in the adaptive practice, another question on similar material shows up. So that is a nice way of like experimenting with their knowledge, seeing the results, keep going until it more internalizes. And then I had two types of reflection that I wanted to do. So one is reflecting on their studying habits, you know, looking back after the test and going, okay, what did I do to study? Did it work? Do I want to do that again? Do I want to change that? Looking on how they encountered the material. So how much practice did they actually do? Was that good? Would reading be more helpful than trying the problems, like reading through other people's solutions, the worked problems in the textbook, or would, you know, like all that kind of reflection. So there is different style of questions each week. And there was like 3 or 4 of them. And some of them were about the actual content, how they encountered that content. Do they have any questions remaining? How can they get answers to those? And every reflection started with, in this week, you encountered the following topics. So they were given something to start the process of looking back on the week that was very much related to the content, but then the questions were more reflective of how they encountered it. The study questions were approximately 2 or 3 questions per hour of lecture on the bigger picture of the material. So this is reflecting on how does the topic from this week relate to the topics from the last couple of weeks? Those kind of questions. So they were math questions. The reflection was more like, you know, type in an answer or multiple choice into some sort of quiz, and then the study questions were write your answers, upload what you wrote, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to have all of these in order to have a functioning class that everybody was getting a similar experience, but somehow making this accessible and somehow making this more open to students who weren't necessarily able to keep up with the intended course structure, so that they don't immediately fall off the course and go, oh no, I can't catch up. So there's all of those. And then also I had to do something to have deadlines, because if I start giving extensions and all this kind of thing, it becomes unwieldy, especially with over 2,000 students. But if we had flexible deadlines on everything but the tests, and the tests were based on all the homework from the last 4 weeks, that gave students something that they can hang their hat on, so to speak. Okay, so what technology did I use to accomplish this stuff? So part of it was, so we're using the Canvas-based Quarkus system for our learning management system. And so it has auto-graded surveys and auto-graded quizzes. And so it was absolutely wonderful to be able to have So for example, the tutorial assignments, having TAs grade all the tests that we had them grade and also tutorial assignments would have been very difficult. And so what I ended up doing is creating quizzes about their answers. So instead of having to write out all their answers and upload it, they have to write out all their answers and then answer questions like, of all the questions you answered, which of the integrals that you wrote in all of your, as your answers to your questions, which of them integrated vertically, so dx, sorry, dy, or horizontally dx, that kind of thing, where they had to write, like, click buttons mostly, it's mostly multiple choice because we're auto grading, but just give them some reason to finish so that they could actually answer these questions and get credit for having been in tutorial. So submission was online. We could still have people go to online tutorials, do the work, and then submit it online. They could go to in-person tutorials, but if they weren't too, like if they were working too slowly and they didn't get it finished or they had too many questions, the TA didn't have to collect it. They could still go home and finish it on their own time. So it was more flexible in that they were encouraged to go to tutorials, much easier if you go and get help from the TA, but there are other options as well. Generally speaking, the students who don't mind working with other people seem to appreciate this approach and would still go to tutorial, and the people who started out working on their own, anecdotally, I've heard from TAs, they were like, yeah, they didn't last long. They were only working on their own. They were getting the questions anyways. They didn't need me. So there's multiple ways of going through that part of the course. And I also use the quizzes for badges. So there was a bonus mark for, well, okay, I took all the badges and added them up. So if you got all of the badges, you got 1 extra % bonus on your final mark. And the idea was to encourage pro-social behaviors, good studying behaviors, things like that. And so there was like a little badge that this award-looking thing that I downloaded. It was a little graphic, and then I typed into it things like formed a study group to study for a test or an exam. And you could claim the badge by clicking on the link to the quiz. And then for that particular one, I think it asked how many people did you work with and what was one of their first names or something like this. And then the one that encouraged people to post on the message board, it was like, use the, you were supposed to comment under the pinned post for that badge, and then you would copy and paste the URL into the quiz so we knew you actually got there. And so these actually, what I'm describing aren't quizzes, the ones where you copy and paste, they were surveys. So if you have a graded survey, it automatically gives a mark for just submitting anything, which I'm not going to check 2,000 of these. So yes, theoretically, students could just mash their keyboard and click submit. But from the ones that I checked, students seemed to be into it. It gave them an excuse to interact with either others online or in person that was not self-motivated. They could be like, oh, talk to me and we can both get a badge. So there was that aspect to it. So yeah, the auto-graded surveys and quizzes and things like that. I already talked about the adaptive practices. One thing I want to point out is there was 3 different levels that you could adjust them to. So when I created the adaptive practices, I used the easiest level because it was supposed to be prep for lectures. So it's prep in the sense that you're, as a student, you log in, you see the part of the textbook that you're supposed to be using for the homework. So you get to look at a couple of examples. Some of them had videos. And then after doing that, you do the questions. So if the student already went to lecture, already went to tutorial, already kind of knows the stuff, they could just quickly click through that and get to the questions. But for students who couldn't make it to lecture or wanted to work ahead or anything, honestly, any excuse to get them to read math, I'm happy. So if they wanted to read through it, great. But it also meant that like the fact that students were still showing up to lecture tells me something about the utility of lecture, I think. For that particular one. So the adaptive practices were the mandatory ones. And it also meant that students who knew the material would get through it quicker because they would not have any extra questions added to it. So we could advise them, hey, if you're taking too long on the homework, maybe come ask for help. And that could be like a self-diagnostic tool to understand how they're doing. Then we used Mathematize for a more advanced set of problems. So we made them optional. They weren't for marks, but we said, you know, if you're studying for the test, that's more what you want to do. Because if you can get those questions, the test questions are slightly easier, but in that ballpark, you might benefit from doing that. So for the students who tried a question on the mathematized problem set and were like, whoa, I don't even know where to start, they had other options. They didn't have to do that. But the students who wanted those questions that would really challenge them and help them solidify their knowledge, they had access to that. And so for the students who couldn't even start those, like the adaptive practice wasn't enough, we just had a list of suggested problems from the textbook that also came with solutions so they could check if they got it right. For trying to actually use instructor time wisely, I made it so that if anyone had problems with the course structure, keeping up anything that was outside of the actual math, they were welcome to visit me, which is a lot of students. And so I'm very grateful that I've learned how to use TidyCal with if this then that, so IFTTT.com. So if you've heard of this, you might know how old it is, but it's been around for a while. And basically TidyCal is like Microsoft Bookings, it's like Calendly, any of these programs where you have a booking page and students can click on whatever booking they want to make, and it automatically goes into your schedule. And so by using if this then that, I got TidyCal to send the booking to my Google Calendar. But if my Google Calendar already said I was busy, even if it wasn't with an appointment, it wouldn't show that time to students. So I could block off time by simply just putting other things in my calendar at that same time. So it was really helpful because then I could offer way more times when students could meet with me without actually, like I was offering 15-minute meetings over 5-hour chunks of time. And then like as my day filled up, there were fewer and fewer bookings. So if they got to it in advance, great. Otherwise, maybe they'd be down to like a few times. And so that worked really well for the students who just weren't getting the hang of I don't know if it was student life or this course or what was going on. But we figured it out while we met online. We used Piazza for message board. We used, remind.com was for students who needed reminders. Like some students do not want to check their email. They get inundated with emails. I've learned this many times from talking to students where they're like, yeah, I just can't. Everybody's always emailing stuff. So if I want to remind students, the ones who really want to get that reminder can sign up on remind.com to get text messages. So I can send out a text message if something's due the following Monday, the Friday morning, I can be like, reminder, your homework is due on Monday, things like that. So not everyone has to get it, but those students who need that constant reminder can. And so they get to choose this. And if they regret their decision, they can change it to email only instead of text message.
Sorry, Lindsey, you have about 1-2 minutes left.
Okay. Anyways, so these are some of the things I used. And that created different paths through the course. I'm sure you can kind of imagine that some students would actually go to lecture, attend the tutorial, submit everything when they're supposed to. Maybe they have a question, they post it on Piazza. Maybe they learn something from that and they redo their study questions. I had optional deadlines for everything but tutorials, so they had till the end of the semester to revisit and resubmit anything they wanted. And a lot of students use the study questions as sort of a summary of the course when they were studying for their final exam. Whereas some students immediately got behind. They're like, oh, I'll watch the recording of the lectures later because the online section recorded it, things like that. So maybe the student needed the reminder, so they got text messages, things like that. So in the end, they had lots of things that they could study from for the final exam, but it didn't have to be what the previous person used. And so what I learned from this experience is, yeah, it is possible to provide structure in a universally designed course without compromising active learning or accessibility. And so this is sort of a summary of some of the stuff I talked about. Second point, students use alternative supports. That's not necessarily a bug, but a feature. I feel like a lot of times I'm like, oh, but they didn't do the intended thing, but they got support. So maybe that's the point. Students will use tutorial deadlines and test deadlines to organize their time. So if I only have 2 strict deadlines, tutorials each week and tests every 4 weeks, that's what they organize their studying around. So I didn't actually have a huge problem with having all the deadlines ultimately be at the end of the course, because they were suggested deadlines, and they use those tests to kind of reinforce them. I just wanted to point out Obsidian if you're ever trying to keep track of something that's complicated and you like learning knowledge management systems. It's been really helping me with this. Okay, and then, yeah, here were some of the objections that came up in conversation with other people and thought of myself that actually turned out not to be as bad as I thought. So if anyone has a question about these, they're welcome to ask. And here's some references, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lindsey, for your informative talk, especially for those who teach and coordinate the first year calculus courses like myself. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately, but if you have questions, you can just go ahead, guys, and